What I want to do now is introduce Chief Ben Barnes from the Shawnee tribe. Chief Benjamin Barnes of the Shawnee tribe was elected to his position in 2019. Prior to that, he served the Shawnee tribe as second chief for 7 years and was a leader in the tribal gaming industry for 20 years. The roots of Chief Barnes' service go back to his volunteer efforts to revive the Shawnee language. Upon taking office with only a few fluent Shawnee speakers remaining, he declared 2021 to 2030 the decade of the Shawnee language. Barnes previously founded an interdisciplinary research group called the Ancestral Pottery Traditions of the Shawnee Project, an initiative to reclaim traditional Shawnee ceramic pottery traditions. He has worked closely with tribal scholars, artisans, archaeologists, historians, and more to learn about ancient ceramic technologies. From this knowledge, he and other tribal citizens are working towards recreating their ancestral arts. He advocates passionately for truth, accountability, reconciliation, justice, education, and human rights. His work extends beyond service to his nation, bringing together truths and traditions and framing and crafting tribal policy and law. Most recently, he co-edited the book Replanting Culture, Community Engaged Scholarship in Indian Country. He's a member of his people's religious community in White Oak, Oklahoma, and it has framed his efforts to find redress to the harm traditional communities suffered from Indian boarding schools and re-education centers. Looking through this lens has shaped Chief Barnes and the Shawnee tribe's efforts to find legislative activism in local, state, and national levels, as well as a voice for Indigenous people at the United Nations. Chief Barnes.
Anyway, Ben Barnes, kita yokupi noki okamasa wanoki. Wapakamisi talminilipe nuochipia. My name is Ben Barnes. I am chief of the Shawnee tribe. I'm also a member of the White Oak religious community. And I don't have a whole lot to add after Chief Wallace's presentation and a very thorough discussion about Shawnee history, but maybe I can add a little bit of nuance to it. I have a presentation I've prepared is one that we gave at Indigenous Peoples Days last year at Kansas State University. But I think it's only appropriate that as we're talking about some of the things the Shawnee tribes experienced, it's curious that there's a lot of parallels and mirrors between Chief Wallace's testimony and the information I'm going to share with you today. So I hope you find the information I'll share with you interesting. But this is our tribal flag. And I didn't explain this when I gave this previously, but so many of you are here, my brothers and sisters from other tribal nations. That is our dance ground. So those of you, the Longhouse people, may recognize, what that looks like. So for us in the early 80s, our Hukamawikwe, our queen lady of our community, of our traditional community, we're represented by 6 elder women and 6 elder men. And from them, they elect from amongst themselves a speaker. And that speaker is perceived as chief. And so everybody thought that was the big guy, but they don't realize he's actually the sock puppet for 12 elderly folks. And so that's where this idea of Shawnee's having this chief. And so while I'm a political chief and I represent my community to the tribal nation, we still have this structure of 12 old folks. And so those are those 12 stars, 6 and 6, 6 old men, 6 old women. And that red border is our ceremonial ground. And of course, I won't bother to translate the big star, but that big star is Metelemueta, Kokumtena. So for those of you that know, this is our Godhead, and like our Haudenosaunee brothers and sisters, we see that as a grandmotherly figure. And so down at the bottom is white oak leaves, Wapakamisi. That's our word for white oak. And it's important, not only for our use in ceremony, it's also where this is at now. Because for us, This is the axis mundi. This is the center of the world. This is the belly button to the universe for Shawnee people. And so I love this flag, not just because I'm a patriot to my people, but also because this was done with discernment of elderly folks saying, this is what's most important to us as a people. Let's make sure that tradition, religion, and ceremony is always remembered. That let's not think about economic development. Let's not think about politics, but you center yourself in that dance ground. This is where the world comes to a stop. This is where we come to pray for the continuance of the universe. And so for Shawnee peoples, I think that that also helps us frame our understanding of where we should be as political leaders, as chiefs, as elected council peoples. So I'm so appreciative for Hulkamawi Kwe, Victoria Darty, when she came up with this design in consultation with other elderly folks. And it's been a guidance for us ever since they made it, and probably out of the early 80s. See if I can advance the slide. So as Chief Wallace described, 26 states, we are the most traveled in the United States. We've lived in more states, and it's just, for myself, as an early council person, I think I was a bit of a pest for the previous tribal leader. And so he sent me and my partner, Roy Baldridge, he's now the second chief of the tribe, but at the time we were just both councilmen. He sent us on the road to do consultations, NAGPR consultations, Section 106 consultations, consultations with the United States government. So it put us on the road a lot. And I really didn't understand the depth and the breadth of Shawnee history and expanse of where all we lived, whether it was in Piedmont regions of Virginia, West Virginia, and Maryland, all the way to Chihuahua, Mexico. We were finding historical records of villages, on the Brazos River in Texas. We found records of everywhere we would go, we would encounter Shawnee history across 26 states. It's just absolutely incredible. And so what I want folks to understand from this period, people were engaging with the Shawnee as a nation. We had France engaging with us as a nation, England, Spain, Mexico, Republic of Texas, and ultimately the United States. So much so that Spain gave the Shawnees a treaty, and they gave us a land lease in the Boot Heel of Missouri around Cape Girardeau. Chief Wallace mentioned it. And we ended up trading that land because of westward pressures. But folks from this Piedmont regions of Virginia, West Virginia, and elsewhere started self-removing into what would become that Boot Heel region of Missouri prior to 1790, started establishing himself on the Mississippi River just to avoid westward pressures. In 1825, we was approached trading that Spanish lease from the Spanish crown, trading that for 2 million acres, nearly 2 million acres in Kansas, in northeast Kansas. And so those Shawnees were also traditional Shawnees. They had established a traditional community in Cape Girardeau. They took that, closed that dance ground, closed that community up, and gave that land to the United States, because it went from Spain to France through the Louisiana Purchase and ultimately the United States. So we closed that up and traded it for the 2 million acres in Kansas. In 1825, those Cape Girardeau Shawnees arrive in Kansas City, Kansas area. And so if you can imagine Kansas border, it's from the extreme eastern edge of Kansas at Kansas City, going nearly 2 million acres to the west. That includes the capital of Topeka. It's an extremely large box of Kansas. And then the Indian Removal Act is passed. And Chief Wallace's people were the first to be removed from the Lewistown Reservation. Subsequently, Blackhoof was the perceived leader of the communities of Hog Creek and Wapakoneta. And at Hog Creek and Wapakoneta, they were going to be removed separately and apart, because I don't know why. The historians in here may know the details of why it was later than the Eastern Shawnees and the Seneca Cayuga brothers and sisters. And they really are brothers and sisters. My wife is Seneca Cayuga, so my grandkids are Seneca Cayuga. And I don't know why it took us so long to move, but Blackhoof's peoples at the Hog Creek and Wapakoneta reserves would ultimately be moved 2 years later. And so they would move in the fall. He would not live to see his people be removed to Kansas. So Blackhoof's peoples then joins our bunch of Shawnees in northeast Kansas from Ohio. And it's at that time that they're saying, wait a minute, where's these absentee Shawnees? They all run off to Mexico. They said, well, they're not coming. So they diminished our reserve down to half, about 800,000 acres. So they got rid of the westernmost half of it and left us with a smaller rectangle, but it's still substantial, 800,000 acres. It's a substantial reservation. And then the Civil War breaks out. The Shawnee, my Shawnee, sides with the Union, and we're not penalized as other tribal nations are for siding with the Confederacy, but we're not exactly rewarded. They're saying, thanks for siding with the Union, but it's time for y'all to leave. So Shawnee started leaving Kansas on foot, started voting in on foot and going into what would become Oklahoma. And they start settling in various areas. And eventually the Shawnees pay for rights to settle amongst the Cherokee Nation and to become full citizens of the Cherokee Nation. And that right still exists today. So I can still be a Cherokee citizen because Shawnees paid the Cherokee Nation directly for the rights to be a Cherokee citizen. So we still enjoy that today, as do our Delaware tribe brother and sister. They did similar. So Chief Wallace went through, gave a very thorough discussion of the 3 different bands. Here's the seals of our tribal governments. Of course, the Shawnee tribe, Sawanoki at the top, that just means Shawnee people. Sawanwa at the top of the east of the absentee, that says amongst the Shawnee. And then of course, Chief Wallace's people seal at the far right. And it was one of the things that was intriguing to us about this land loss that we've seen from the time we've left Kansas is I didn't understand what that meant. I didn't understand what removal of a people from its land, or probably more specifically, removal of the land from the people, what it does to a nation. But I found parallel data amongst African Americans in the United States who've also not been able to benefit from the ability to build individual wealth in this nation by coming to the wealth creation process so late due to the act of slavery in the United States. So if you look at median net worth of a household in the United States, these are the totals for white households, black households, Hispanic, and others. Mean net worth for white households, black households, Hispanic households, and others. There's also a QR code if you want to grab that QR code and find some more data on this and go to the source. But when you get to Native American people, there is no data on this. And the data we do have suggests it's worse than this for Native peoples because of the depredation of our lands and communities, the taking away of our ability to generate not just wealth for our nation, but wealth for our peoples. So when we're speaking about fundamental differences, this is one of those metrics that really can't be argued with. And I know it's hard to talk about these things in this era where we're talking about differences based on race. But just this past week, I saw an interview with Dave Bautista, the big guy on Guardians of the Galaxy, huge head, tattoos everywhere. And he was a professional wrestler like WCW. And he's given this interview about how in Hollywood, he takes his acting seriously. And so in Guardians of the Galaxy, all these little pithy little quips he comes up with, he ad-libs those. But he's complaining that when he goes in front of directors or casting agents, they only see Dave Bautista, this big giant man. And they always want to give him the big giant man role. Every one of us in this room accepts that is true. We all accept that is true, that people have a preconceived notion of what kind of person Dave Bautista is, and therefore it makes him difficult to cast in roles that he wants to have. But if I was to suggest in some areas of our country that Indians and black folks are treated differently, we say, no, that can't be true. That can't be true. So these type of economic injustices are some of the things that we need to speak plain to. One of the efforts that I've been involved in for quite some time has been the Indian boarding school issues that our people still face all over the United States. It's not a point of honor that my home state was once we believed it had the most amount of boarding schools in the United States, but now we're at 90. But recently we've been surpassed by Alaska. And Alaska has well over 100 boarding schools of legacy. And I think nationwide we're at 400 and some, I believe. And also I'm on the board of directors at the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. And so I encourage you to check out their work. I think it's at boardingschools.org. And it's important work that we're doing at the Native American boarding schools, because we want a Truth and Healing and Reconciliation Commission to go and talk to elders and to get to the root of some of the problems in our communities. Those of us that are traditional people, those of us that are struggling to keep our communities speaking our languages, we know that boarding schools are the root of many of these problems. But it's only been because of, I'm not a boarding school survivor, but I am elected as chief of the Shawnee tribe, and I have to speak for those, not just the ones that are still alive, but also I have to speak for the dead and those that attended boarding schools and their experiences. And as I have traveled about the country talking to boarding school survivors, I've started to understand things differently. It was in Anchorage, was it last year or the year before? There's a woman stood up and she says, it's only now, just now, that I'm understanding what this is that you all are talking about. She goes, I thought I didn't have a bad boarding school experience. She goes, but now hearing the testimony of my relatives tell me what they went through in these boarding schools, I realized that I wasn't unaffected, that I learned to be the nail that didn't stick up, to be the one that's not noticed, so that they wouldn't do to me what they did to them. She goes, I didn't realize that I had taken that and incorporated that into who I would become as an adult woman, and I kept all the men that I loved at a distance because I didn't want people to get close enough they could hurt me. And she says, I didn't know that I had done that with my own children and grandchildren. She goes, I'm only now understanding this. And so I didn't understand intergenerational trauma. I didn't understand how it affects your character. I didn't understand how it affects your grandchildren's futures. But these boys went into these places and they didn't learn to be fathers. They didn't learn how to be grandfathers. They learned how to be superintendents. The girls that went into these places didn't learn how to be mothers. They learned how to be matrons. And some of these kids that came out learned how to be brutal. Or they had a hole inside them that they had to fill with something else. So it's in traveling around the country and listening to elders talk, I understand a little better what intergenerational trauma means. But it's even those of us that still never encountered boarding schools firsthand. We're still being hurt by these places. In Shawnee Mission, Kansas, inside of that reservation, everyone's heard of the place Shawnee Mission, Kansas. They think it's because there was a Shawnee Mission. No, there was 3. They called it Shawnee Mission because it was the epicenter for missionizing the Shawnee. The Shawnee Quakers were there, the Shawnee Quaker Mission, the Shawnee Baptist Mission, and the Shawnee Indian Manual Labor School, where little children were sent, and the profits of those labors were enjoyed by William and Thomas Johnson, the superintendents of that school. And it was during this time that we first started talking with them, right before the pandemic. We first started having conversations with Shawnee Indian Mission about their exhibits. They were awful. They were just awful. They never consulted with the tribe. It's owned by the State Historic Society in Kansas. And it's also on the National Registry of Historic Places. But not only that, it's a national landmark, so it's one level up. And so even falling underneath NPS, National Park Service, they were still not talking to tribal nations. And we found this egregious just at the CRO level, the Cultural Resource Office level. So we got involved in having these conversations with them about their interpretation. During those early conversations, we were on maybe only 7-8 months into the conversations about fixing some of the interpretation. In Canada is when the kids in Kamloops were found during that period. And the Shawnee tribe's like, wait a minute, we probably have a moral imperative to have a bigger discussion about this for our own selves, because we're not talking about this in the United States. not as much as they are in Canada. We need to elevate this conversation. And so we started approaching Congress alongside of NABS about a National Boarding School Healing Coalition, about a commission, the Truth and Healing Reconciliation Commission. And it was in doing that work we started researching our own issues that we had at this site and to try to undo some of the myth making that they had told about how great this place was. And we started finding out stories of every family we talked to, we would find someone that went to this place. Second chief of the tribe, we found out he had hit a relative there. Our THPO, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, she found an auntie, a great auntie she didn't know she had because she was the elder of the children, and she died there and never came home. So her family never talked about her. How do you mourn somebody you never knew? In 1850, I found a record of my grandma's grandpa have attending in 1850, and he ran off 5 times that summer. Little boy ran off 5 times in the summer. And as we got to researching, we found out more and more about the site and how it was being interpreted. They were using it as a vehicle for fundraising, where they were having parties where people would dress up in historical garments. Once they even dressed children up in a little red face and black pigtails for Indians, and they had a fundraising party. But that's not even the most egregious thing they did. They had seances at this site. They were running seances for $60 a person. You could go into the non-public areas and read off lists of dead Shawnee kids' names, and you could try to conjure up their voices to speak with those dead Shawnee kids. To this day, the Shawnee tribe and the other tribes that sent their children there have not yet received a policy from the city of Fairway, Kansas, or the state of Kansas. Again, there's those 3 boarding schools. The QR code takes you to a link of other boarding schools nationally for much more information. If you care to grab it, I'll leave it up there for just a second. Is that the same one? Let's see. Oh, here's some other residential schools in Kansas. Haskell Industrial Training School. A lot of you folks know that one. That's the Haskell is today. Great Nemaha. I still haven't quite figured that one out. I've asked the Ioways if they know which one that is. I'm not sure which one Great Nemaha is. Cobb Manual Labor School was in Kansas, the Kickapoo, the Osage, and the Potawatomi Manual Labor Schools. So Kansas didn't have as many as Oklahoma, but these were all over the nation. And I think the closest one to here, maybe someone can correct me if they know, I believe is not Carlisle, maybe it would be Carlisle, but there was one in Kentucky there, one of the earliest ones around 1815 was opened, and it was the Choctaw Academy in Kentucky. So Choctaw Academy in Kentucky, but you're right, it could be Carlisle, given how close we are. This is old data. I need to replace this. But the website will take you most recent data. Yeah, so we're over 400 now. Yeah, and some are still open. Now, given some of these that are open now are being ran by tribes, so a lot of those are now being ran by tribal nations. So they mentioned this early on about this book we published with this. I've co-edited this with Dr. Stephen Warren. And while it seems like a shameless plug, I'll get to the reason why it might be important to you here in West Virginia today here in just a minute. But inside of it is an article Chief Wallace and her co-authors wrote about the Newark Earthworks. So if you want to read her article, it's within these pages. And ignore that price. It now has a soft cover edition, much more reasonable. But I want to bring this up because this is one of the things that I feel is important. Because when tribal nations come and talk to you, we talk to you about real issues that matter to our nation. We talk to you about the things that really matter to our people. And so while some places across the country, and West Virginia University is definitely one of those places that is facing an existential discussion about the futures of humanities. And the questions become, does humanities cause anything that's not a tenure track job? Is there any real world outcomes? Is there any practical uses for this degree? Well, this is what engagement with tribal nations, this is what community engaged scholarship does. Communities working with academics, working with universities. You're not working on us. You're not working around us or working, on our data sets, or worse, coming in and bungee jumping in, grabbing your data and bungee jumping out. These are problems that we see in our community that we want to address. And inside the disciplines of academia, whether that's anthropology, linguistics, archaeology, there's tools in universities. That universities can be tools, and the research outcomes for universities are better because they have real practical, real world, appreciable outputs that really help communities. Inside of there is documentation about the Miamis at the University of Miami in Ohio, the Stolo people in British Columbia, and the work they've done with Fraser Valley, and as well as University of BC. Also, Chief Wallace's tribe, my tribe, and other institutions that have done real collaboration with tribal nations and what that looks like. So what I say to you today here in West Virginia is that this is a great event, Bonnie. Great event bringing us here. There has to be more of this. And these conversations you're having with the real tribal nations, talking about real problems that our people are experiencing. I am not just a tribe that lives in Oklahoma and that's my boundaries. We're the Shawnee tribe. Our citizens live in 50 states. I have some that live in US territories. I have some that live abroad. 2 years ago, some misguided legislature put together, here in West Virginia, a misguided legislator put together a bill that would have created 25 brand new tribes, including the Shawnee tribe of West Virginia. That doesn't make any sense. I am the Shawnee tribe of West Virginia. I'm the Shawnee tribe of every state. But they also want to create the Lakota tribe of West Virginia. So my argument to that is this is what happens in the absence of our conversations. When we're not in the rooms having these conversations, there's these misguided attempts towards DEI, misguided attempts towards affirmative actions, misguided attempts for inclusion that's being so hyper-inclusive now excludes the real people you need to talk to. So this is one of the works we've done and continue to do with archaeologists, anthropologists, and others. And I also have a reading list of books that I like for Shawnee history. You know, there's some that I don't like, and they're not on my list. So this, I think this is a pretty good list if you want to like have, you know, a syllabus of Shawnee material. And that's really all I have to say today. And if there's hope, there's some questions. And I hope maybe it rounded out a little bit what Chief Wallace offered.
Yeah, I think so. How about a round of applause for Chief Ben Barnes? I do want you to take a look at the printed program. There's a page with various resources and organizations, and one of them that we listed was the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. We also, Ken just went around table to table. We also have partnered with the Carlisle Indian School Project, and they shipped us some brochures. They couldn't be here today because they have another commitment for Indigenous Peoples Day. But, you know, this is a major attempt toward educating Americans about something that's just almost never discussed in K through 12 programs, and people enter adulthood very ignorant of the harm that's been done and that continues as a result. So I think, let's see, we had someone drop off a question, and our moderator is Dr. Rodney Hughes, so I'll let him take it from here.
Thank you very much for your presentation. One question from the audience. I'm a history major and would love some insight on the best and most respectful way for non-Native historians to approach serious topics in Indigenous history and have these tribal histories, learn these tribal histories to provide a broader and correct scope of history.
So first I want to offer a clarifying point is we're not saying there's no place for sole authored research, for individual solely authored research, because there's still great places for that. You know, there's some authors I think really do a great job, like Dr. Calloway. He does a great job examining U.S. history with tribal nations and treaty works and unpacking that. But for tribal nations, I think one of the places to have an engagement is to attend events like this. Attend other events where you know tribal nations are going to be like, whether it's NACI or whether it's the American Society for Ethnohistory, which is kind of a little hit or miss on the attendances, but there's organizations that you can come to, you know, and there's also tribal colleges and universities that tribes are building up. Muskogee Creek Nation has a college of the Muskogee Creek Nation. There's places that there's places to go. In this day and age, I think it's ought to be easy enough to use the Google and, you know, find good reputable sources for tribal nations and engagement with reputable tribal nations. And a lot of us, are still developing some of our educational outreach to third parties because we're still doing educational inreach to our own citizens. So doing the outreach to universities is still not where we would like it to be.
Couple questions from the virtual audience. One, on the topic of mounds, there are mounds here in the Kanawha Valley that have been disrespected, especially the one in South Charleston, which has stairs and a bandstand built into the side of it. Is there anything we can do about this issue?
Yeah, you could repurchase the mounds and donate it back to the tribal nations that they're associated with. That's one thing I think places could do. It's one of the things that we've determined about national boarding schools in our discussions. We think those boarding schools need to be returned to the people that they were taken from. So I think that's the same thing needs to happen, because the reason that site, the Kansas City, the Shawnee Mission Boarding School, gets misinterpreted is because the Shawnee tribe's not there. It's not in charge of interpretation. The same is true with mounds. The same is especially true with problematic sites like Serpent Mound that somebody spoke to earlier. Serpent Mound gets terribly misinterpreted, and it's a Fort Ancient site. That's also why it's not on the Hopewell list.
One final question from the virtual audience. What are your thoughts on land acknowledgements regarding your nation?
I'm conflicted about that. My wife has moderated my viewpoint on this. And actually, it's ironic. I'm wearing an orange ribbon today. I used to be very critical about people who just pin a little ribbon to their collar and call themselves good, And it used to annoy me to no end. It was like, oh, they put the ribbon on. So that's all they, just did their little wear. And, that's pretty hypercritical, right? And I think, this is the beginning where we start, So the land acknowledgement, I used to be really critical of that. It's like, you're just going to do that and nothing's going to come of it. You have no intention of helping Native peoples. So I used to be very critical. But now I look at it as an open door. So I think if the place is doing that, treat it like an open door. And in fact, the prophet, Tenskwatawa, his name meant the open door. And so when we talk about these things, it's oftentimes I find myself in front of an open door and I just need to step through. So I'm reminded time and time again to not look at things from that negative perspective of, oh, it's just simply a genuflection towards, do virtue signaling. No, it's an open door, and take it as an invitation.
Anyone else here present in the room who wants to ask a question of Chief Ben Barnes, Shawnee Tribe, or anyone else online, if you want to put your question in the chat? I really appreciate your question about land acknowledgement, because I think too often they are just strictly pro forma, and it is like pinning a little ribbon on your shirt or a little flag on your lapel or something, with no thought behind it. And I remember getting a question from someone actually on campus who wanted to etch the land acknowledgement into marble or something, and I said, please don't do that. And I said that, what are you doing to back that up as an entity within the university? And I said, also, understandings evolve, and you may not have all the perspectives that are needed it's impossible to really thoroughly acknowledge the land in terms of 20,000 years of human habitation. So I wouldn't etch it in marble if I were you. Let's try something a little more subtle and keep working on it year by year.
Another aspect too we've seen is like with the land grant universities.
Yes.
Trying to make right.
Mm-hmm.
And so at another, not too far away, Big Ten university, they wanted to get right with their land grant status, and they looked down the list of all the tribes whose lands they'd profited from.
Mm-hmm.
They were like Coeur d'Alene. They were Western tribes.
Yeah.
And so they wanted to get right and offer those tribes, in-state tuition and special scholarships to attend that not so far away Big Ten university in the capital of a major state nearby. And they didn't want to talk about Eastern Shawnee or Shawnee. And they actually resented us saying, but what about us? You've left us out of this discussion. Literally, our DNA is in your soil. And so also our Seneca Cayuga brothers. So I think it extends to just be thoughtful, mindful of who all's involved.
I want to thank our Honors College Dean, Damien Clement, who early on signed on to being a funder, having Honors College be a co-funding partner of this big event. And I also work with a student in Honors College who wanted to explain further what is land acknowledgement and how does that tie into the Morrill Act and the parcels of Indigenous land that were sold off to fund the land grant universities around the country. So I just want to draw the audience's attention to another link that's on your page. The virtual audience got a PDF of this, so they can click open all of the links. For you folks, you can we can email it to the registration list. But this is the High Country News, really excellent investigative journalistic piece, of which Dr. Margaret Pierce contributed to. I didn't use very good grammar there, so English professors in the room, excuse me. The Morrill Act of 1862 Indigenous Land Parcels Database. And so we find out that here in West Virginia, with the establishment of West Virginia University, that I think there was something like 35 somewhat significant land parcels sold. Others might have been 1 acre or 2 acres, something like that. But people usually don't have any understanding of it. And this article lets you link in, click in. I've shared it with all of the people on our committee. I share it with everybody I can to really start to think about that on a deeper level. Now, what I didn't tell you about Dr. Hughes here is the job that he has.
I'm affiliated with what's called the Center for the Future of Land Grant Education. So we're thinking about exactly the sorts of topics you're describing.
So one of the things I would advocate for always as a furtherance of any DEI conversations is tribal nation inclusion, which means getting rid of these ridiculous pre-United States ideas of state boundaries, that tribal nations be exempted from out-of-state tuition fees, and at the very least, some sort of scholarships, because Shawnees were removed from this country. So we'd like to come back to West Virginia.
That sounds like something that Rodney should be able to tackle and get back to me in a week or so.
Gauntlet is down, Rodney.
We looped in, I guess we would say, and invited Rodney to be part of our meetings in Native American Studies, and he's been a very receptive member in those meetings and in those discussions, and we're hoping that something positive will come out of that.
Please do, because I like to shame that Big Ten University aforementioned.
And the team colors are, no. Okay. All right, well, we should move on. I think if we have no more questions, thank you very much, Chief Barnes.